NBC News correspondent Jesse Kirsch is outside the Carter Center in Atlanta. We are also joined by New York Times Chief White House correspondent Peter Baker. Jesse, walk us through the plans for President Carter's funeral and that final Georgia to Washington journey that he took so many times.
Yeah, Anna, so we're at the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta right now, but the state funeral will officially begin more than 2 hours from here in the former president's hometown, Plains, Georgia. That's where his journey in life began, and that is where he will also be put to rest. So the former president's remains will be escorted by current and former members of his Secret Service detail. They will bring his remains to a hearse. Then, as you mentioned, he will make a trip past his childhood family farm, and then he will continue on to Atlanta. He will be pausing at the Georgia State Capitol, where there will be a moment of silence. Then he will lie in repose here at the Carter Presidential Center for more than 2 days before traveling to Washington, D.C. Once in Washington, he will make a stop at the U.S. Navy Memorial. That is, of course, a tribute to his service in the U.S. Navy, before continuing on to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state after a ceremony with members of Congress. After that, there will be the National Funeral Service. That is where we expect that President Biden will eulogize his predecessor, someone he has known for decades, considers a friend, and we are expecting that eulogy on Thursday, January 9th. That is also being declared by President Biden as a national day of mourning. That same day, after that service, President Carter will return to Georgia one final time. He will return to Plains for a private funeral service at the church where he was a Sunday school teacher for so many years, and something that he's been known for, very well known for, in his time after the presidency. And then mourners are welcome to line the route as he travels from the church to his home in Plains, Georgia, where he will be finally interred in a private ceremony. And one of the last moments involved in all of this, and certainly one of the more powerful images, will be a missing man formation flyover by the U.S. Navy, a tribute to someone who was a U.S. Navy lieutenant before ultimately becoming the commander-in-chief for the U.S. Armed Services. Anna.
So 8 days of celebrations and honorings and tributes and services. You touched on this, Jesse, but what more are we learning about President Biden being selected to deliver Carter's eulogy?
Yeah, so as President Biden has boasted about, he is someone who was an early endorser of Jimmy Carter when he was Jimmy Who. And of course, he came to be this national figure, the peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, and rose all the way to the highest office in the land. Over the years, the two, as you can see, were photographed together time and again. We know that they were last together more than a year ago at Rosalynn Carter, the former First Lady's funeral. So it had been many months since they'd been together, but we're expecting that final farewell tribute from President Biden to one of his predecessors, the 39th president, Jimmy Carter. Anna.
Jesse Kirsch, thank you for that reporting. Peter, what are you expecting to hear during President Biden's eulogy?
Well, I think he talked about this a little bit on Sunday night when he appeared before cameras in St. Croix, where he's on vacation. He talked about how Carter is often dismissed as a man from a bygone era, that the character traits of honesty and integrity and humility are no longer seen as in vogue. And he argued that that's not the case. He doesn't think that Carter is a man from a bygone era, but a man of all times. And it's a relevant moment for him to talk about that, given the transition that's about to happen to a new president who seems the antithesis of everything that Jimmy Carter stood for. Carter was obviously a failed politician, as Jonathan Alter, his biographer, says, in that he lost re-election, lost in a landslide. His political skills were not up to the moment. But obviously, most of the people who are talking about him these days are recalling his integrity, his character, his decency, and so forth. Obviously, in the incoming President-elect Trump, we have a president who's been convicted of crimes, who's been found liable of sexual abuse and business fraud, who, in fact, believes in divisive politics. And I think that you're hearing in Biden a sort of subtle, not overt, but very clear comparison to the tenor of today's politics, and urge that America think about what Carter represented and what he tells us about how our country should conduct its national affairs today.
Also really interesting, you're reporting that we'll hear a pair of posthumous eulogies from Carter's predecessor, President Gerald Ford, as well as Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, and their eulogies will be read by their sons. Tell us about how those plans came together.
Yeah, I think that certainly Walter Mondale, who was younger than Jimmy Carter, expected to outlive him, and so he had written a eulogy for the day he thought he would deliver it in person. That didn't happen. He passed away 3 years ago himself, but left behind what he wrote. And his son Ted, I think, is going to read it at the service. We have it on our website at thenewyorktimes.com. And of course, Gerald Ford, who was the man that Jimmy Carter beat in 1976, a bitter campaign, and yet the two became close friends after leaving office, reconciled their political differences, and found they had more in common than they thought. In fact, so much so that when Gerald Ford died, he had asked Jimmy Carter to deliver a eulogy at his services, which Carter, of course, did very graciously. So Ford, too, has left behind for his son to read a eulogy for Jimmy Carter, and I think it'll be an evocative moment to hear those two sons read those words next Thursday.
Yeah, I'll be really curious to hear their thoughts and the way they saw the man and the political atmosphere and environment, what they can offer to us today as far as that goes. And as you know, the presidents themselves take part in planning their own funerals, partly because they're just huge logistical efforts, which may sound grim, but ex-presidents often make light of it. For instance, the Carter, in this case, you report that he objected to initial plans that had called for him to be transported back to Georgia by train. He told a staffer, quote, "If you take my cold, dead body across the U.S. by train, I'll haunt you until the day you die." Peter, what do you think the plans for Carter's funeral say about how he wants to be remembered?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I think is really fascinating about this is it is a very pomp-filled, very elaborate set of services and remembrances for a very humble man, right? I mean, he was not the person to stand on ceremony. When he took office, he broke tradition by getting out of the limousine on the inaugural route to walk to the White House to show his humility. He didn't want Hail to the Chief played when he entered the room. He sold the presidential yacht. He carried his own luggage onto Air Force One. He wanted to show what I think is a genuine trait of his, which is this idea of humility, but also humility of the office, to kind of deconstruct in a way the imperial presidency. And I think he came to learn, to some extent, he went too far. Eventually, he did say it was okay to have Hail to the Chief played, at least on occasion when he came into the room, because there had been this idea that perhaps it had diminished the majesty of the office, that there was something important about these rituals, something important about these traditions that we hold to the office. And so he clearly decided, and it had to be a conscious decision, to go along with some of these elaborate rituals held at a moment of a presidential passing, even though it doesn't fit his natural character. Remember, he went back to Plains, Georgia, to live in the house that he and Rosalind built in 1961, a small ranch house that's only worth about $200,000 today. Think about that. Not some big ranch or big, fancy mansion like most of these presidents. He didn't cash in. He was, in fact, somebody who not just talked the talk, but walked the walk. Yeah. And yet he's going to have this very elaborate funeral arrangement. I think that was a concession to the majesty of the office that he came to respect.
But you mentioned Plains, Georgia. He's got this small town heart. I mean, that town only has, I think, hundreds of people total. And that's where he chose to live out his days. Peter Baker, thank you very much.